Hi, my name is Eric Fielding. Noel Larson, who initiated the Out and About program in Woodlake, has asked me to do some videos from home in light of the coronavirus and all of us maintaining social distancing. I'd like to thank her for that. She does an incredible job, and when things return to normal, please take advantage of the many things Woodlake offers. We have tons of activities here. We have field trips, bowling, trivia games. It's just a wonderful program. So thank you, Noel. I'm going to do a series of reasonably short videos. The first one I'm doing today is on the Beatles, something that most of us have grown up with and know a little bit about, but hopefully I'll be able to fill in some details and make an interesting discussion about the Fab Four. In a way, the Beatles started in 1954 when a movie called Blackboard Jungle was released, and Bill Haley had a song in that called Rock Around the Clock. That song really changed modern music. Prior to that, Frank Sinatra, Doris Day, big band music dominated the radio airwaves. After that, a new sound came in, rock and roll. And for the next 10 years, there were many singers who took advantage of the new music, many people that you've heard of course, but also still a lot of male crooners, people like Paul Anka, Neil Sedaka, Frankie Avalon. But during that time, four young lads were growing up in Liverpool, England, and they were going to form ultimately the Beatles. The Beatles actually got together in the early 60s in England, and initially they were called the Silver Beatles. The core of the group initially was John Lennon and Paul McCartney, who were childhood friends, and very soon after that they brought in another childhood acquaintance, George Harrison. Originally, the fourth member of the group was a gentleman named Pete Best. Pete Best was a pretty boy, and apparently Paul McCartney did not like competing for that attention. So at some point, when Pete Best had to miss a few gigs, and they had Ringo Starr come in as a substitute to cover some of the performances they were doing in Germany and in England, they replaced Pete Best permanently with Ringo Starr. Ringo Starr's start with the Beatles, though, wasn't all smooth. The first actual single that the Beatles recorded with George Martin, their famous producer, was called Love Me Do. And Ringo Starr was not on that recording because George Martin hired a studio musician, another drummer, to fill in, thinking that Ringo Starr was not up to the talent at that point. Anyway, the Beatles through 1962 and 1963 started developing a following in England. And in fact, they hit the charts in 1963. They hit the number one position, in fact, with that first single, Love Me Do. At the time, the Beatles were also doing a lot of cover versions. Some of them you're familiar with, like Do You Want to Know a Secret, and a lot of other songs like that. However, in America, Capitol Records, that theoretically owned the rights to the Beatles recordings, were not convinced that this new music coming from Britain was saleable in the United States, and so they resisted releasing the Beatles songs. So a couple of the Beatles songs were on alternate labels, Swan Records for one, and a few other people, but the Beatles did not hit in America. Ed Sullivan, however, in late 1963, heard of the Beatles and the phenomenon that was taking place across the water, and actually signed the Beatles before they had any hits in America to appear on their shows twice in early 1964. Ed Sullivan was a genius because by the time the Beatles hit American shores in 1964, Capitol had finally relented to the pressure and released I Want to Hold Your Hand, the first of 20 different Beatles singles that would reach number one in America. I Want to Hold Your Hand ruled the charts for 7 weeks and issued in a new era of type of music. After that, the British invasion was full on. In fact, British acts so dominated the American charts, with the exception of Hello Dolly by Louis Armstrong, which interrupted the Beatles' run of number one songs, almost all the music in 1964 hit the top of the charts was British musicians or people really following the British sound. Anyway, the Beatles hit number one in America in 1964, early 1964, if I Want to Hold Your Hand, and they followed it up with two performances, as I mentioned, on the Ed Sullivan Show. They opened the first Ed Sullivan performance with All My Loving, and the crowd in the Ed Sullivan Theater went wild. From then on, they were unstoppable. The second Beatles recording in America was called Money Can't Buy You Love. Well, the second official release, anyway. That was the second single that Capitol released. But by that time, Other record labels that had rights to the earlier Beatle recordings were trying to cash in on this new Beatlemania, and they released earlier Beatles songs like, for example, She Loves You. And the phenomenon is when All My Loving reached number one in early 1964, the top five songs in the United States were all Beatle recordings, which has not been achieved before or after, and is really a fluke just from other labels owning their rights. So the Beatles were off, obviously, to a tremendous start. By the way, just a little bit of trivia. The Beatles have had 20 number one records in America, as I mentioned. Very few people would guess who's in second place in that list. And it's 19 number one recordings, and that record is owned by Mariah Carey, who just last year had her Christmas song reach number one, and that became her 19th number one recording. 1964 was a glorious year for the Beatles. They also did a movie that was a mock documentary almost about themselves, and that was called A Hard Day's Night. The title to that came about because while Ringo Starr was helping obviously perform in that movie, he said at the end of the day, boy, it's been a hard day's night. John Lennon wrote that night a song using that line, of course, which is Hard Day's Night, which was featured prominently in the movie. The movie was really a madcap adventure showing about this band coming to America, fans following them everywhere and going crazy. And that was really the phenomenon in 1964. When the Beatles gave live concerts, at that time their concerts were very short, 20, 25-minute affairs. And people who attended those concerts swear they couldn't hear the Beatles sing at all. The fans were going so crazy at that time reacting to their music. So 1964 was a banner year for the Beatles. It would be followed up in 1965 by yet another movie, Help, which was another phenomenon success. The premise of that movie was that Ringo Starr was wearing a ring that belonged to somebody else, and that somebody else desperately wanted back, and these evil people were following him all across the world trying to get that back. The big singles from that were, of course, Help and the phenomenal Ticket to Ride. In the early days, John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote almost all of their songs together. And in fact, they agreed very early in their relationship that all songs that they wrote would be credited to both Lennon and McCartney. That became a point of contention later on, particularly after John Lennon's death, when Paul McCartney wanted to be recognized for some of the tunes that he was prominently responsible for. In fact, he even suggested they go back and change the copyright on some of them to read McCartney Lennon to reflect who had done most of the work on the songs. But of course, that's debatable and never occurred. But in the early days, they wrote most of the songs together. And in fact, it wasn't until the 67, 68 period when George Harrison and even Ringo Starr started contributing to some of the Beatles records. And in the early Beatles records, a lot of the songs they did were also cover songs, old classics, and so forth. Now, Capitol Records in America was now belatedly trying to really capitalize on the Beatles' success. And so while the Beatles' albums in Britain and the rest of the world contained 14 songs, the Capitol releases, the long playing records in America, only contained 12 songs. And so during the period from 1964 through 1966, ending ultimately with the release of Sgt. Pepper in the United States, the Capitol Records was able to release two albums more than the rest of the world did, capitalizing on the Beatles by putting fewer songs on each record. So that's an interesting thing. The Beatles really, you can argue what came first, the chick or the egg, but I think what's phenomenal about the Beatles is they started with simple melodies and simple tunes and evolved over the period of their life to much more sophisticated music, as did rock and roll in general. So whether the Beatles led the charge or were able to adapt with changing taste and sophistication of listeners, either way, they were really a band at the right time producing the right music. In 1966, the Beatles produced two of their epic records, Rubber Soul and Revolver. These were the first two records where the Beatles started to change their sound. They had songs on there like Nowhere Man, obviously not a love song, Michelle, a more sophisticated melody, Eleanor Rigby, Norwegian Wood, songs that sound very different than I Want to Hold Your Hand in some of their earlier recordings. Norwegian Wood is an interesting record to talk about. The the Beatles had met Bob Dylan, another legend, in 1965. And even though they became good friends, Bob Dylan always felt that the Beatles stole from him. And so he did a song ultimately on his 1966 album, Blonde on Blonde, called Fourth Time Around. And the purpose of that song was he sort of stole or copied or emulated the music from Norwegian Wood. And he called it the fourth time around because he thought that three prior incidences, the Beatles had stolen his music or sound for some of their recordings. The Beatles toured through 1966. They soon became tired of touring, however, and they also wanted to work more on their studio albums. Touring was difficult. You couldn't hear the Beatles sing. Uh, there was some resentment in some parts of the United States, even towards the Beatles. In late 1966, while in America, John Lennon actually said something like the Beatles were bigger than Jesus Christ. And of course, that led to very negative reaction, particularly in the American South. So in early 1967, the Beatles decided to work strictly in the studio, and they came up with the idea, mostly credited to Paul McCartney, by the way, of producing what would be really the first concept album that the country would know. And that was, of course, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Everything about that album was very carefully crafted. If you look at the album cover, there are pictures of Marilyn Monroe, Cassius Clay, Albert Einstein on it. And there's a picture of the Beatles dressed, looking at the Beatles dressed differently as the Sgt. Pepper's band. And it's almost like they're observing their own funeral. And the way the Beatles were saying goodbye to a previous form of their band and welcoming in a new type of their band. And maybe through the guise of being Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, they were able to assimilate this new role and become different. Everything about Sgt. Pepper was different. Sgt. Pepper was much more sophisticated music. It really was a concept album. It began and ended with this idea of introducing themselves as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Interestingly enough, today, singles, 45s as we know them, are always released from albums, and they're used to promote an album so that if you like a particular song, you'll rush out and buy an album. In the early days, in the 1960s, record companies thought the opposite. They thought that people would not buy the album and the single separately if it contained the same song. So what they wanted to do was release songs separately as singles and not have them appear on the album. And so in early 1967, while the Beatles were working on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Capitol Records pulled two songs that were slated to be on it and removed them from the album and released them as singles. Those two songs, very popular in Beatles lore, are Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. And there's another interesting thing about those two songs. Those two songs reflect the fact that John Lennon and Paul McCartney were now writing songs separately more than they were together. Sgt. Pepper introduced a lot of songs, but these two songs really illustrate the delineation of the talents that between the two Beatles. Even though they were both writing about places that were in England, Strawberry Fields Forever is clearly a John Lennon composition, and Penny Lane is a Paul McCartney composition. And they were two sides. It's called an A-sided single, where both sides were released to radio stations and both were played extensively. But it really showed that the two of them were evolving as artists as two separate people. Interestingly enough, Sgt. Pepper also contains, in the very last song on Sgt. Pepper, the last Beatles composition that the two Beatles really truly worked on together, and that's A Day in the Life. Paul McCartney had a little bit of a song, and John Lennon had a little bit of a song, and they combined the two in A Day in the Life. The middle bridge part is Paul McCartney, and the rest of it is John Lennon's tune. So it's an interesting composition and ends on that famous final note that signals the end of Sgt. Pepper. Uh, anyway, Sgt. Pepper, of course, was a huge success. Many people went on to try to duplicate the concept of a concept album, including the Rolling Stones, who did My Santana's Secret Majesty. That was a much less successful venture than what the Beatles had done. But the Beatles also tried to emulate their success. Paul McCartney ran with the idea of Sgt. Pepper, and they decided to do a thing called Magical Mystery Tour, which was a walk through the streets of London on a bus.